Alrighty, hopefully you all have copied down the chart already. This chart covers just a few causes and effects. This is real simple, 4th grade social studies type stuff, right? We just wanted to come up with a few effects for these causes that we've listed. So weather. If weather is the cause, what might be the effect? Okay, what does weather affect? It might affect the way you dress. Okay, if it's cold outside, you wear a jacket, right? If it's hot outside, you wear shorts, things like that. Okay, number of minutes that you walk. If that's the cause, what might the effect be? So the number of minutes you walk might affect the calories that you burn, right? If you're walking for exercise, the longer you walk, the more calories you're going to burn. Okay, number of hours worked. Well, that might affect your paycheck, right? If you work a long time, your paycheck's probably going to be higher. The number of study hours. If you study for a really long time, probably affect your grade, right? If you don't study at all, your grade's not going to be any better, or maybe it'll be the same, maybe it'll be lower. But if you study for a long time, it's probably going to raise your grade. Okay, the length of the song. This is kind of a weird one. It made sense to me because I'm from the generation where we had to download songs off of Napster. And when songs were really long, they really took a long time to download. So to me, the length of the song affects your download time. The number of pizzas. Okay, what might that affect? Well, it's kind of vague, but if we're talking about buying pizzas, the more pizzas you buy, the more you have to pay, right? So the number of pizzas would affect your price, okay? Just a few simple causes and effects, okay? Hopefully this is not a big deal to most of you, okay? But what we're about to do is make it a little bit more mathy, okay? In math, instead of using the words cause and effect, we're going to use the words independent and dependent, okay? They pretty much mean the exact same thing as cause and effect, for now at least, okay? The independent variables are the things that cause the dependent variables to change, okay? So on this next slide, you'll see that I've created this chart over here, and it has a list of a whole bunch of words that are synonymous with cause and effect, okay? I put those at the top. Underneath, you'll notice I put independent and I put dependent. Those are going to be our main words we're going to focus on today, and really, for the next few days. We'll get into the other ones later, right? But I would go ahead and jot down the rest of this table just so that you have a good idea of some of the other things that we're going to be talking about. For example, X and Y. You can't interchange those. X is almost always going to be independent, and dependent is almost always going to be Y, okay? You'll notice up here on my wall, I already put little dependent and independent signs on my Y and my X up there. Okay, we'll talk about that another day. Domain and range. You have no clue what those mean right now. That's okay. Just put them on there. Input, output, leader, follower, replacement set, solution set, X, and then F parentheses X. This is actually pronounced F of X right here, okay? So go ahead and jot down that table. Just know that everything on the left side means the same thing, everything on the right side means the same thing. If you're already done writing, note the definitions up at the top. The independent variable is a variable whose value does not depend on the value of something else, but a dependent variable is a variable whose value does depend on something else. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go on, but tell me if you need me to pause the video. Okay, so we're going to actually rewrite these situations that are somewhat familiar to us into more mathematical statements. Okay, so at the top it says rewrite each situation showing dependency and identify the dependent and independent variables. Okay, so again, we're kind of identifying the cause and the effect. So number one, an employee who works longer hours will receive a larger amount on her paycheck. Okay, so the story is about working, right? Working longer hours, larger amount on your paycheck, right? Do you see a cause and effect there? The cause would be working longer hours, like we talked about at the beginning. The effect would be a larger paycheck, right? But let's talk about independent versus dependent. We said that independent is just like the cause. So I'm going to write that over here. Working longer hours, okay? That would be the independent variable, okay? The effect is like the dependent, so it'd be a larger paycheck. That would be our dependent. But now let's form that into a more mathematical statement. The blank depends on blank, right? Well, the dependent is the thing that depends on, so the paycheck depends on the hours worked. Okay, so basically what we've just done is we've said that the dependent depends on the independent. Okay, and that's going to be true for all of these. That same order is going to stay true. Okay, so number 2, a box with several books weighs more than a box with just a few books. So let's try to figure out what the cause and effect would be here. Okay, we're talking about a box and its weight and how many books are in it, right? Well, the weight is going to depend on, right, how many books are in there. Okay, so the weight depends on, I'm doing this backwards this time, the weight depends on the number of books. Okay, so again, thinking about that order and what I just talked about up here, the dependent is the thing that comes first here, right? So the weight is dependent, and the books is independent. Okay, you have to put the books in the box first to know how much it weighs, right? You kind of think about the order here and what comes first and what comes second. What's the cause? What's the effect? All right, so let's look at some more examples. This one, we're actually going to write 3 different ways. So we're going to start with depends on, because that's what we're most familiar with, right? So we have the number of hours I study and my grade point average, right? So let's figure out what is going to be dependent. What depends on the other thing? Does the number of hours depend on your grade point average? Or does your grade point average depend on the hours that you study? I'm thinking it's that one, right? Your grade point average depends on, it's the dependent, the number of hours that you study, right? So that would be independent. Okay, so if we're going to transfer it into this depends on statement, independent goes second, right? This is always going to be your independent. So blank depends on the number of hours, and that blank would be your GPA, right? GPA stands for grade point average. So my GPA depends on the number of hours, okay, and that's dependent. But now we've got these other 2. We've got determines and is a function of. These are just more mathematical ways of writing dependency, okay? So determines. This is something we use in our everyday life, right? The weather determines what you wear, okay? But we need to determine, get it, if it's independent first or dependent, right? So going back up to the story, does the number of hours you study determine your grade point average, or does your grade point average determine the hours? It's opposite, right? The number of hours you study determines the GPA. Okay, so in this case, it's backwards. The dependent came second, and the independent came first. Okay, and the reason it switched is because of this middle word. Okay, so the middle word really does make a difference as to what order it's going to go in. Okay, last one is a function of. This is a fancy thing that you're probably never going to say in your real life, unlike the first 2, but it is definitely the most mathematical way of saying this. I'm just going to tell you straight up that is a function of is exactly like depends on. Your independent is going to go in the second spot, and the dependent is going to go in the first spot. So we're going to say that the GPA is a function of the number of hours. Okay? So it's just a fancy way of saying depends on, really. Okay, so this is the same thing as depends on. Alrighty, so on the next slide, you'll see that I've kind of summarized these 3 to make it a little bit easier, but you are going to be expected to know the difference between all 3 and how to write any situation in any form. Okay, so here's a box that kind of summarizes all 3. When you're using the term depends on, it needs to be dependent first, independent second. When you're using the phrase determines, that's not a phrase, it's a word, you have independent first and then dependent second. When you use the phrase is a function of, dependent is first, independent is second. So again, I'm going to give you a second to jot this chart down. This is going to be super, super useful to you as we ask that you use different wording to describe different situations. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but tell me if I need to pause. So using that box that's in the top right corner, we're going to rewrite these 2. We'll have 2 more examples and we'll call it a day. So number 3, the fire was very large, so many firefighters were there. Okay, let's first determine what's dependent and what's independent. Okay, does the size of the fire depend on the number of firefighters, or does the number of firefighters depend on the size of the fire? Okay, think about it. What is depending on something is the number of firefighters. Okay, the number of firefighters does not come first, right? First, the size of the fire happens, and then we determine how many firefighters to call, right? So, knowing those two variables, we can now pick any one of these to write, okay? I'm going to actually go with the most difficult first, just because we're less familiar with it, right? So blank is a function of blank. Looking right here, we know that dependent needs to come first. So I just look at my variables, and I see that number of firefighters is dependent. So I can rewrite this. The number of firefighters is a function of the size of the fire. Okay, I put independent last. Okay, so let's do another one. Number 4, sales tax in the state of Maryland is 5% of the purchase price. Okay, so I've got sales tax, Maryland's not important, purchase price. Now a lot of people stop and look at that 5% and they think, oh, 5%, that's got to be something. But that's a number, right? That's not a variable. We know that it's 5%, so that's not going to be represented by a letter. We only do that when we don't know it. So we're not going to consider anything that's a number as a variable. Okay, so we just need to look at the two and determine what comes first, right? What would be independent, what would be dependent? Think about it. Okay, hopefully you determined that the sales tax is dependent. Okay, the sales tax comes after you already know the purchase price. Okay, so now we have to pick a statement. Let's try determines. Okay, with determines, independent needs to come first. So I just look at what I just wrote. Independent is purchase price. I'm going to say the purchase price determines the sales tax. Okay? Always really helpful to figure out what the variables are first and then try to put them into one of those statements. So 2 more problems. These are going to be a little bit about myself just to make it a little bit more interesting. So there's my dog Sajak over there. He's been putting on the pounds lately. No lie, he really has. So the vet recommended that we feed him less food. Okay? So in this story, we've got my dog's weight and his food, right? Those would be our 2 variables. Notice on the slide I didn't put independent and dependent because I want us to try to get used to putting him in there and knowing just in our mind what goes where, right? So it depends on. Does the food we feed him depend on his weight, or is it vice versa? Okay, his weight depends on the amount of food, okay? Right? If I feed him a whole lot, he's going to gain weight. If I don't feed him very much, he's going to lose weight, okay? Blank is a function of blank. This might be the hard one, but just remember it's the same as this guy, okay? So again, weight is a function of your amount of food, right? And honestly, I know this problem's about my dog, but this is true for people as well, right? A person's weight is a function of how much food they eat. If they eat bukus of food, obviously they're going to weigh more. Okay, last one, determines. This is the one that's different, right? The food determines the weight. Okay, this is the one that's backwards. Alrighty. So one more. My husband is a huge Dallas Cowboys fan, like mega fan. I mean, seriously, one of the biggest fans you'll find. So there's a picture of us on the couch with our Cowboys jerseys on and our dog with his little ref jersey. So thinking about my husband and his fandom, right? What is a function of what? This one's kind of vague, so I'll tell you what I was thinking here. I'm going to say his mood is a function of the score, okay? When Cowboys are winning, guess what his mood is? Super pumped, right? Cowboys are losing, his mood is super, super cranky, okay? So determines. What determines what? Well, the score determines his mood. Okay? So this last one, again, thinking about independent versus dependent. What depends on what? Again, his mood depends on the score. Okay? So again, just thinking about independent versus dependent, all of these, for these two, the top one and the bottom one, you always have dependent first and independent second. For the middle one, it's opposite. Independent first, dependent second. Okay? So again, there's just some personal ones. I'm sure you have some in your life as well. So you're going to think of 2 dependency statements that are in your life. Okay, this will be part of your homework. You don't have to overthink it. In fact, it might be easier if you think of a statement first and then try to find a picture that matches it, if that makes sense. So like the weather, right? If it's hot outside, you wear shorts. You can find a picture of yourself wearing shorts. Not a big deal. But I would love to see pictures with them. You don't have to do that. You're not going to be turning the pictures in or anything. But I'd love for you to kind of connect it to some pictures. Scroll through your Instagram, see what you need to do, think of some dependency statements that are actually all around you. So at this point, the video's over. If you have any questions or I need to go back to anything, just let me know. And hopefully you feel like a pro with independent and dependent variables.